Well, I'm very excited to introduce our presenters today for our electric vehicle roadmap, or excuse me, electric vehicle subgroup meeting to highlight the City of Tucson's Eevee Roadmap and building codes. Our special guests today are Michael Catanzaro, who is the energy manager for the City of Tucson, and Daniel Bursuck, who is principal land use planner for the City of Tucson as well. And I thought I would put up their picture in their bio because they have so many different accomplishments. I'll give you a second to read them all. And I'd also like them to say a few words as an introduction as to kind of augment the information. Daniel is also a member of our SCN steering committee. So I want to certainly thank him for participating with one of our subgroups as well. And so I'm going to stop sharing, but I'm going to ask that Daniel and Michael go ahead and introduce themselves a little more personally so we can get to know you. And then you're welcome to share your screen, gentlemen, and start your presentation.
I'll start. My name is Michael Catanzaro. I'm the energy manager for the City of Tucson. Really a joy to be here. I'm really excited. I've attended a few of these. I should be attending more. Having transitioned from University of San Diego for 20 years, running sustainability there. Now I'm at the City of Tucson almost for 4 years now. And there's no doubt this is one of the premier networks, I think, for sharing information. This is kind of an extraordinary resource, and I'm really grateful for it. So looking forward to sharing our progress today. We have a lot going on in the city. We'll just kind of highlight, I will highlight the Eevee roadmap that was put together, and then Dan will give the meat of the presentation with the codes. So Dan, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for having us. We really appreciate it. Yeah, so I am a land use planner with the City of Tucson. I primarily do code amendments and code changes for the city. So any changes to our zoning code, building code, they will go through me and my group, and we will make those changes. We are starting to ramp up a lot of our changes related to climate and climate adaptability, and changing some of our standards related to that. So as we as we work through the process of our climate action plan, we're seeing more and more interest, especially with the guidance from our mayor and their administration in making changes to our building standards. So it's exciting to kind of share some of the first things that we're doing. I am sure we'll have many more as we move forward. So I'm excited to share it with you. I'm also excited to hear the conversations related to other communities in the state and what you're starting to do, planning on doing, have done already. All of that information is really helpful for all of us as we move forward with this. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll let Michael get started here, but thank you.
Eevee Roadmap was proposed last April of 21. It went before mayor and council, and then this last January, it was formally approved. I will put in the chat, I'll drop in the chat probably a couple of links, one to the roadmap itself, and then the other is to our website that we've created to kind of communicate to the community the roadmap itself and our progress so far. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the guiding principles that the plan was formed following. I won't sit here and read them to you, but I think the idea here is to promote clean, renewable energy, decarbonize our community, and really think about tomorrow. There's a lot of challenges I think we face, as a hot region. Climate resiliency, grid resiliency is also another key factor. And so how do we partner with our local utilities to make sure that what we're doing is intentional, impactful? And I think you'll see some pieces of that in the following slide. So Next slide will kind of show you an overview of the comprehensive nature. There are 78 unique and separate actions in our roadmap. And these are the lead departments on these. And so it really cuts across the entire city. So, you know, this siloed approach certainly doesn't work. It's a collaborative effort. And we were meeting every 2 weeks as a city team to go through the roadmap, make sure it was fully vetted, and kind of just get through all the hiccups of a major initiative like this. Communication is really the key, I think, to a successful implementation. And as you can see, a diversity of departments and people from across the organization are really going to be necessary to move this forward. The next slide will kind of show you the roadmap, just the high level overview of our roadmap. We separated our actions into immediate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And I think the right-hand side of the screen is what I'll call your attention to here. You know, there's different areas in terms of outreach, leading by example, the policy, the code amendments, and the rest of these. I think what it is a really comprehensive way to address electric vehicles. It's easy to get kind of caught up in our boxes. As I was preparing with Daniel, we were talking about, he's like, well, everybody's just so wants to know, how does this affect code? And from my perspective, everybody wants to know how this affects our fleet. You know, so there's a lot of different areas that this certainly touches: the infrastructure for our fleet, the public charging. So it's really kind of, I think, kind of hits almost all the areas of local government. The next, I think maybe this bus will kind of move, showing we're on the path. If you hit the next button, Dan. Yeah, thank you very much. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just kind of give you a few of the highlights of what we've accomplished in the first sort of 6 months here since it's been formally adopted. We partnered with Tucson Electric Power on a charging demand analysis that's looking at what are the needs from a community perspective in terms of EV charging. We're going to take those results, overlay those with the existing EV charging network within the city, and then determine if the city needs to be more proactive in making public charging available. I think that there's a lot of range anxiety, kind of made up stories people have about transitioning to electric vehicles. So sometimes that visible charging in highly visible areas is really critical to at least bridge that gap. We've also deployed the Evie website. And again, the intention there is to kind of communicate the successes, and then as we go along, get community input on what needs to change. We're really hoping, I think, as a city to lead by example. One thing I didn't mention a couple slides ago is I think we have the largest EV bus fleet in the state. We have 6 now, and I think we're getting 4 more. Supposedly by the end of the month, supply chain issues notwithstanding. So it's really, and I think, an opportunity again for the city to sort of demonstrate to the community our commitment. So in that, we've also developed a fleet analysis to look at what vehicles need to be replaced, the electric options for them, and taking that to mayor and council soon. And really actively pursuing the electrification of the city's light duty fleet. So once these trucks become available later this year and next, making sure that we're transitioning all of our vehicles. And then from the policy side, this is really Dan's bailiwick, but making sure we have the right policies in place for greater EV charging, adopting EV ready ordinances, which he'll talk about for new residential, multifamily, and commercial developments. And then our parking folks are working on establishing and expanding and enforcing EV parking rules. There's a small provision in there too to utilize EV parking fees for future electrification opportunities, which is a really kind of cool way, I think, to institutionalize it and make sure we're really supporting electrification throughout. And I think that's really it in terms of a high level overview. I just wanted to give you kind of a flavor of what the city's doing, and I'll let Dan take over from here, talking about the code amendments and policy changes.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that overview and kind of setting up the conversation related to some of the code amendments we've been working on. Unfortunately, I do not have any animated buses or anything of that sort in my slides. So, you know, I might, maybe for next time, I don't know. So anyways, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the amendments that we've done over the last really year or so. Some of these were kind of in motion previously prior to the roadmap, but the roadmaps really set those priorities for the city, which has helped to really push them through and helped with some of the implementation of some of this. So I'm going to talk a bit about, zoning and building code amendments for residential and commercial development. Stepping back, kind of looking at, you know, kind of what Michael has talked about, and really some of the items that have driven the changes that we're looking at right now, is really this immediate step within the 6 months. And as Michael had said, you know, adopt the Eevee Readiness ordinance for all new development. And this was really what, and there's a lot more detail in the document related to some of these steps, but this really pushed us to start looking at what we can do and what changes we can do to really start to build the infrastructure. So starting in April 21st, April 2021, we really sat down and said, you know, this, and started to look at what changes we could do to our code related to that. So immediately after that meeting, we met with our mayor and council. And we had been in the process of developing a requirement for 1 and 2 family houses, essentially single family homes, for EV, to have an EV ready plug for all new development. This had been really an outreach that we had done with our building community, but our code community and our sustainability community in Tucson for the last 2 years. We were close to getting it to council, and then the pandemic hit, and it kind of went to the side as we shifted our, you know, focus other places. So it was really great to have the roadmap to kind of bring that focus back on this and push it forward. So essentially, we went to council on June 22nd, 2021. They adopted this unanimously, and this is applied to 1 and 2 family dwellings. It is based on the International Code Council, so we wanted to make sure that those future code amendments would be kind of in line with other jurisdictions, and it was universally kind of utilized. We specified, so just, this is maybe a little technical, and I wasn't the one who was in charge of a lot of this, so I can try to explain more if need be. But we specified a 40 amp outlet for this, essentially to be universal with the majority of electric vehicles on the market, but also to help reduce cost overall. So this was a conversation we had. We had some people who wanted a 50 amp outlet versus a 40 amp outlet. The reason we did so was because in single family homes, at least new single family model plans, what would happen is we went from 40 amps to 50 amps. It jumped them up from a 200 amp kind of electric service panel to a 400 amp electric service panel, which would shoot the cost up, you know, I think on average like $1,400. This was a conversation we had to where there is a possibility that if someone wanted a 50 amp, they could make those improvements themselves. But that's the reason why we ended up on the 40 amp outlet for this, for the lower one. But it is required now for all of our single family homes in the city. What's kind of interesting about this is that there were incentives, and this is something that I think you know, we need to be careful, I guess, about as a city, is not promising that those incentives would be there after we pass regulations. So there was an incentive with Tucson Electric Power for single family homes to put in these. But that did go away once we passed our regulations. We have, as we've been working through the multifamily and commercial, we've been pretty explicit with the fact that that is, while it is currently there, it may not always be there. So we really do need to plan on the fact that those incentives are not there. So they passed this back in June. We had been working on it for about 2 years or so. At the time, when it was adopted, mayor and council directed us to go and look at multifamily and commercial requirements as well, really to our zoning code or potentially building code if need be related to that. So that is what we did. We started kind of looking out and started looking at this. So with that, this is kind of the process that we've had since mayor and council direction back in June. So back in June, they directed us to look at this. We put together a stakeholder group. It was comprised of commercial real estate industry, commercial real estate folks, interests. It was comprised of multifamily housing people, as well as a lot of, we have a pretty robust kind of electric vehicle enthusiast group and sustainability group. So it was a broad group of people that we brought in to kind of help the guide what these regulations were like. Between then and now, and we're supposed to go, we're scheduled to go to mayor and council for adoption next week. So I don't get ahead of myself necessarily, and I'm happy to follow up with everyone once things are settled. We held 2 stakeholder meetings. We had public meetings, and then we presented it to the Planning Commission early this year, who provided us a unanimous recommendation to mayor and council with a couple caveats as far as just follow-up research and data analysis afterwards. So kind of looking at Tucson and national trends and kind of how we got to where we're at. We did a bit of analysis and just kind of research to get an understanding of where we're at. It's really difficult at this point because I think we're nearing the kind of tipping point on EVs and EV purchasing. We're not quite there, so it's hard to necessarily predict, adoption rates. But we do have some things that have, allowed us to anticipate the fact that adoption will begin to ramp up quite a bit in this country. So looking at things like the fact that right now there are about 50 or so EV models. By 2023, we're expecting 130 EV models. Looking at the fact that there are 6 major automakers, including Ford, GM, and Volvo, who have pledged to phase out their gas and diesel vehicles by 2023 to 2040. And just understanding that, the building lifespan starts at 30 years. So we need to get ahead of this and understanding that retrofit costs, and I'll show you a little bit of some of the costs that we've kind of tried to tie down with this, that retrofit costs, make it challenging to do. So getting that infrastructure in at the least, trenching, putting in conduit now, so we have that ability in the future to put in those EV spots is really important. Also understanding that this is a federal priority. They're looking to expand to have 50% EV share by 2030. And then just watching and seeing that there's this acceleration of deployment of EV technology, charging infrastructure. It's all just moving really quickly. This kind of, as you start to see new and different kind of vehicles, we're anticipating a rapid increase of people utilizing it. Even just looking at Europe and their adoption rates and how quickly they changed from 20% to 60% in a lot of countries is pretty impressive. So making sure that we're ready for that. I think this is kind of the interesting thing here when I was looking at this chart, is just the fact that as you see the conventional kind of vehicle sales and really it peaking around 2015, and then really kind of year after year dropping as we go forward. I think it's really important to kind of notice that is occurring. We did a bit of analysis on the Tucson area as far as what our EV share is. It's pretty low. It's like below 1% in Tucson region. with higher rates kind of in our more affluent areas. So to the north, we looked at kind of the foothills. You see a lot of in Oro Valley, who is here with us, which is great. Oro Valley having the higher adoption rates, as well as kind of down to the southeast, which is Vail and some of the residential communities with lower rates in the city. This kind of just showed us the importance of equity in EV charging facilities and making sure that people have access to them. One thing we did do, we went and looked at registered vehicles by zip code, and we looked at the model year, and as kind of a proxy for anticipating adoption, we utilized this to kind of get an understanding of really what vehicles are being purchased and new vehicles in the city. This number was calculated in October, so I anticipate that it would be larger than the 2020 number. So that was kind of a truncated year there. Next slide. We also looked at peer cities to kind of get an understanding. Again, none of this is exact, and we don't really have exact numbers on when people will necessarily adopt, when this will really kind of hit that tipping point. But we did look at other cities. Again, national EV share is about 2%. We're around 1%. But we looked at some other areas in the region, such as Albuquerque. They have a 2% EV ownership. Their actually regulations are similar to ours, to where they adopted them a number of years ago. So they haven't really updated them to reflect kind of current adoption rates. So they currently require 2% on all new development that's over 200 spaces. Those are all stations. And then they have incentives kind of similar to us. So currently, City of Tucson has an incentive for spaces to where if you put in an EV charging station, you get to reduce your number of required spaces by 1 up to 25%. And Albuquerque is very similar. We also looked at Miami-Dade, Florida, who adopted changes back in 2019. They did a phase-in. So they went from 10% in 2019 to 20%, and that's EV ready, just the outlets. So they're at 20% of multifamily that's greater than 9 spaces. We looked at Salt Lake City, who has a lot of priorities related to air quality, especially in the Salt Lake City area. And we talked to them, and it was interesting. They kind of did the same thing we did as far as calling around, asking other communities what they're doing. And one thing they said when they adopted it was just the fact that they wish they would have been more aggressive with it at the time. And I think going back and looking at things again, when we presented this to mayor and council, our mayor and council, because we went back and talked to them, they said, we'd like to look at something similar to Salt Lake City. So it gave us at least some direction on what they were looking for. But they have a requirement of 25% for multifamily. And then that's a certain percentage, so like 4% stations, and then the rest are related to outlet or EV ready for that. We also did look at some California cities. California's adoption rates are so much higher than ours are. But just to get an understanding of that, as San Jose, California, which has an adoption rate of over 20%, they have, and reflective of that, they have regulations that are similar. So 50% of non-residential are required to have some sort of EV infrastructure, and 100% of multifamily and hotels are required to have EV infrastructure. It's as of now only stations, but 70% conduit, and be ready for that as it comes up in the future. So from this, we started to look at other things as well that kind of influence what we wanted to do. Charging habits and patterns, and I think a lot of you probably know all of this, but it helped to really communicate this to Tucson. So we kind of looked at this continuum of really where charging occurs. Looking at charging at home, and 80% of EV chargers, drivers charge their cars at home. So we started off, it's like plug in your phone at night and that type of thing. We started off with the single family residential, and then realized that about half of Americans do not have access to dedicated off-street parking space at night, and it's generally in multifamily buildings. So this was really our focus of this, was to look mostly at multifamily, because that's the biggest need as far as just having people have the opportunity to purchase an EV and be able to charge that in the future. We also looked at charging at workplaces, because workplaces, you'll be there for 7-8 hours at a time. It gives you a long enough time to where you can actually have your vehicle charged. And then we looked at public charging and other things of that sort as kind of a less of a priority, at least at this point. So those are retail spaces, potentially restaurants, as well as some of the more public spaces, public garages, or airports and things of that sort. So just kind of looking back at the goals related to this from the Eevee Roadmap that helped kind of guide the process. We wanted to create regulations that ensured equitable access to benefits of advancing technology, cost savings, and environmental benefits. We wanted to provide significant cost savings by avoiding future retrofits. So this is that idea of making sure that we get the infrastructure into the ground and not have to go back and do this 5 years from now when we have EV adoption rates that are over 10% potentially. Implement baseline requirements at various commercial locations based on visitation frequency. That's that kind of last chart that we looked at. And then require the most usable readiness for the least cost. So try to do this without increasing a lot of costs. So that's what we were attempting to do. We broke down our requirements into these 3 categories. This is typical for what we see elsewhere. Looking at the conduit, that's basically just putting it in the ground, making sure that it's pre-wired and had the capacity. We found some costs on for this, but it varies widely by region. It varies widely by project. So these are kind of rough costs related to that. And then one up from that is the EV Ready outlet. So this would be providing a NEMA 1450 outlet, not particularly expensive. They can be like $15 to $50 per space just to add that in. But that would provide that charging capability now related to that. That is what we require currently for our 1 and 2 family residential. And then the EV installed stations, which we were careful not to have too many regulations related to because they're very expensive. We've all had some experience with EV stations having maintenance issues. We worked with a University of Arizona class that was just doing research on EV infrastructure in the city, and they did a project where they did research on each of these throughout the city, and like half of them were either not functioning, they were off network, or you couldn't read the screen because it was sitting in the sun all day long and they didn't have anything shielding the actual screen from it. So we were very careful not to over require related to the stations. So with that, this is the proposal that we brought to our stakeholder group and then brought to the Planning Commission. It was adjusted a little bit throughout, but we are looking to require 25% of all multifamily, new multifamily or expansions that are greater than 25% to have 25% EV spaces. And that would be, we opted not to require any stations as far as cost goes. And we left the flexibility up to the owner and the developer on whether or not they wanted to provide stations, which would help them to network the amount of power, or if they wanted to figure out some other way to where they can maybe rent out those spaces just with a plug for a certain amount of money. So anyway, so 10% outlets, 15% conduit. We also added in some parking incentives for these to try to help lower cost. So for each kind of outlet additional beyond the requirement, you can reduce your spaces by 1 for that. Commercial, which is basically commercial, it's just office. There's a couple other uses, but it's mainly office. 20% requirement. That is 5% of the EV Ready outlets, and then 15% for conduit. This one also has the anything above and beyond. You remove your you remove 1 space. Just I saw the chat, Sharon. Yes, we did require a 40. I believe it is a 40 amp minimum as well for those level 2 chargers. And then for retail, retail again, we presented this without this. There's this little exception down here. It was 10%. It's 5% stations, just because of the fact that it's kind of a different kind of use pattern that we see within the retail areas. This includes food and beverage, by the way. So 5% stations and then 5% outlets. We did include this incentive, which is for every station. You can actually reduce it by 2. So again, trying to offset that cost with the reduction of parking. I mean, they may need it, and we see that a lot of times, to where even with parking reductions, they'll still park to the maximum. But we wanted to provide that for them. We did get feedback from our planning commission, as well as a lot of our small business community. They were worried about the impact on small retail. And based on use patterns, we see that larger retail, generally people spend more time there. So we're thinking like the large shopping centers, malls. So we put a cap on this, so where it's basically only places with 100 spaces or more for retail are subject to this requirement. To try to help with that, not to put an undue burden on small businesses, as well as just kind of related to use. If you go to a small retail business, I mean, and you spend 20 or 30 minutes there, it's not really going to be totally effective for charging. But if you go to a mall and spend 4 hours there, you could potentially get a pretty reasonable charge on your vehicle. So we went through and looked at a lot of cost estimates for this. It's been it's tough to kind of pin down. We have some people in our commercial commercial development industry that have been struggling with this as well. But this is kind of what we have seen as far as the range of costs. And the one thing to really point out here is, that this is where you really get that cost savings down the road. It is, for new construction, it's $11 to $19 per linear foot. And then with a retrofit, it becomes $100 to $150 per linear foot. So it's incredibly expensive to go through and have to retrench, dig everything up to do that in the future. So goal here really is to get that infrastructure in the ground so we're ready for it when it comes around. This just kind of goes through some of the incentives that are in place. We haven't really pushed this a lot. We just put it out there so people know that it's available. Again, because of the fact that we know that in the past, those incentives have gone away once we've put it through. But these are the costs overall that we're seeing. Multifamily, about $95 to $960 per space, huge range. Commercial, similar, and then retail with a slightly larger, higher cost, and then some project costs there. A couple additional considerations that we have looked at through this and we put into our requirements related to accessibility. So 4% are required, and this is 1 in 25 spaces, or no less than 1, must be accessible. But this is spaces that are accessible for EV charging. It's not ADA parking spaces, so it's in addition to the ADA parking spaces. This is a recommendation from the Department of Energy, and we've just kind of moved forward with it. And then additionally, we have guidelines in our code related to signage and marking. So regulations and wayfinding, as well as lot design. These are things like not locating all of your EV charging spaces right in front of the building, so a bunch of internal combustion engine vehicles or conventional engines utilize those spaces. But wayfinding, signage, all of those other things to make sure that people are aware of where those spaces are, get them to the right place. So some of the feedback that we've received, and I'll try to hurry up here. There was concern that affordable housing, small businesses would be cost burdened related to this. And there was an opinion that EV charging should be market driven. I think that we have addressed some of this by adding in our exception to retail with less than 100 parking spaces. And that really we did kind of try to lower it by not requiring the stations for multifamily and those commercial uses related to it. There was interest in increasing requirements and phases. We kind of, ultimately the life cycle is 30 plus years. So, phasing something for 2 years doesn't really have that much of an impact. We also are phasing this in a lot of ways by requiring either conduit or ready instead of requiring those stations. So we are phasing it in a lot of ways. And then there's, just concerns that Tucson income levels are not comparable with California cities. And that's part of the reason why we ended up going more towards what we're seeing in Salt Lake City, and some of those other communities that have adoption rate 2.5%, and not 10, 20 plus and that type of thing. So with that, I mean, this is essentially the proposal that we will be putting in front of our mayor and council next week. We are going around and talking to them and educating them. We will see where we end up next week. It was voted 8-0 in support by our planning commission. They did have some additional recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, review the amendment in 1 or 2 years. And then considering, this is related to another portion. We're adding in a site-specific reduction for bars and restaurants and for affordable housing that's been a part of this as well. So they wanted us to consider reducing minimum parking requirements for affordable housing, which I'm totally in favor of. So I'm hoping that happens. With that, City of Tucson will hold a public hearing next week, and we will definitely follow up with the group with the results of that public hearing. But with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I should probably put Michael's contact information on here as well.
Great, thank you. That was a lot of information to cover. We do have quite a few questions in the chat, and so happy to go back and answer those, and then kind of open it up for other questions and comments. And Karen and Danae, feel free to jump in if you want to help with the Q&A as well. One of our earlier questions was from Lori Glover when you mentioned the electric buses, which that's an exciting development. I know Mayor Romero has talked a lot about the electric buses and really takes pride in that fact that you're paving the way. She asks, Lori asks, do you charge buses on level 2 chargers, and what is the range of the buses and the time to charge?
Right now, we're in process of installing level 3 chargers for our buses. When we look at our fleet rollout, it's going to be a significant, I don't think we could do it on a level 2. I think that would take days to charge, because on a level 3, I think it takes between 4 and 8 hours, depending on how empty they are. I don't have an estimated range for our buses yet. As soon as I have that, I'm happy to share that with the group. But really, a level 2 charger wouldn't, it was determined wouldn't really get it done for the electric buses.
And is that because you have so many at the same site, not enough time to charge?
It's because of I think the size of the battery, to be honest. You couldn't, I don't think we could charge them overnight with the level 2.
Okay, because we're looking at the same thing, but DC chargers are so expensive that's a real hiccup. Are you getting any federal funding for DC chargers?
We were fortunate. We had a terrific partnership with Tucson Electric Power. They funded the first round of level 3 chargers as part of the grant that we submitted for the buses. And so they put in for the first few, and so they helped us pay for those. Subsequently, they do continue to offer, I believe it's 45,000 or 40,000 per DCFC port. That's fast charger port for bus incentives or for level 3 charger incentives.
Okay, thank you.
And I know we have ICF in the room, so hopefully they're taking notes too, because there'd be some great opportunities for DC fast chargers here in the Valley as well. I'm going to throw in another question. This one was in the chat from Robert Perez over at Glendale. And he was asking what kind of parameters you were using to determine the classes and the vehicle types that you're going to convert to electric.
Yeah, I saw that. Great question. Basically, it's availability. We looked at all of the sedans; those are all on our list. And then as soon as light duty trucks become available, we've ordered our first Ford Lightning. And then as those become more available, we'll include those. We haven't looked at the heavy duty fleet yet, just because of lack of availability. And I tend to be a little bit more cautious from a fleet perspective of being an early adopter. There's, certainly can be some challenges with that. And so as these vehicles, I think, get rolled out, proven, I think we will be part of that testing and then start to roll out from there. But
Gotcha.
availability was a
Mike,
real
can I
driver.
ask a follow-up question?
Certainly.
Did you notice any patterns when it came to certain departments and their usage that made a candidate vehicle more likely to be converted?
Right now, any vehicle, any sedan that's going to be converted, we're in the process of writing an exception. I mean, the expectation is that we will convert to an electric vehicle if an electric vehicle is available. And so if we don't, there needs to be an exception that needs to be signed off by the fleet manager and environmental services director at a minimum.
I see. Okay, thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat from Catherine Logan. Let's see here. One had to do with, have you considered a possible secondhand EV market, as most consumers tend to purchase secondhand?
I will say that that's been part of our conversations as far as just as we move forward. A lot of the kind of concerns about the regulations that we're putting forth right now is the fact that EVs are very expensive. Most people can't afford them, especially in a place that's not particularly affluent, which is Tucson. But as we move forward, a lot of those the secondary market for vehicles will allow for it to be more attainable as we move forward. So I know that has been part of our conversation for development of our regulations.
And nothing, we don't do any secondhand vehicles. We don't buy used, we only buy new for fleet, as far as I know.
Okay, thank you. There were a couple questions in the chat from Anthony Floyd of Scottsdale. What was the position of the Southern Arizona Homebuilders Association and the AZ Multi-Housing Association? I'm assuming with regards to the charging infrastructure. Did you run up into any problems or apprehension?
Yeah, so Southern Arizona Home Builders Association, that was more related to the 1 and 2 family regulations that we put through. Again, that was a 2-year kind of negotiation process. And part of the, they were reluctant, but they were okay with it just because they can market it. And I think once they changed their model plans, it really wasn't that big of a difference in cost for them. They eventually got there. It wasn't the easiest. It took lots of conversations and going and presenting to them and having them a part of the process, but they eventually got there. Arizona Multi-Housing Association, they understand the need for it. They're very concerned as well about affordable housing as well and overall costs. I wouldn't say they're particularly supportive of our proposal as it currently is. I think they feel that it should be ratcheted back a little bit, but that's kind of where they're at. I think ultimately they'll find, I don't know, we'll see what happens with that, but they're not as supportive of our proposal as other groups may be.
He also asked if, did you take this through your building advisory board for recommendation for city council approval? I believe you did take it through one of your committees or commissions, right?
Yeah, we've brought this through 2 commissions, the CES, and I always forget what that actually means. I think
Mission on
Leslie
climate,
said-
energy, and sustainability.
I always mess that up. That one, and then we have a code committee as well for our building code changes, in addition to our planning commission.
We had Gabe Desmond. How did you decide between Eevee Ready and Eevee Capable for your residential codes? And this goes to his second question. Have you faced pushback from developers?
Yeah, and I think that's part of it is the wanted to provide them the flexibility on a lot of those spaces to where they still have to manage those charging plugs, and if there aren't enough people utilizing them, it's kind of an unnecessary cost at this point. That's part of the reason why we did a portion that were capable, or portion that are capable, portion that are ready. It was also, reflective of our conversations that we had in our stakeholder groups with those multifamily housing people. I mean, part of the reason why we aren't requiring the stations is because of feedback that we've received from those groups, and that's how we ended up there. Again, with all of this, I'm not sure if it's exactly right, but looking at other communities and looking at what we've seen elsewhere, it seems in line with what we're seeing.
Samantha Novotny asked, any suggestions for cities who don't have political buy-in by way of a climate action plan?
Good luck. And then I think really approaching it from a fiscal standpoint too is probably the best approach when you look at total cost of ownership, sustainability initiatives in general. I mean, I think the vast majority, at least of the early implemented strategies, are going to have cost savings and oftentimes significant cost savings. And if you could put a portfolio together to use some of the cost savings to offset some of the increased costs and balance, so to speak, that way, I think that's a really good strategy, and something I employed in my last role. Was really looking just sort of at the economics of all of it, and then just selling the environmental as a secondary benefit.
There's
Yeah,
also a big opportunity. I'm sorry, I'm cutting somebody off. Big opportunity when it comes to air quality. So you can be pushing electric vehicles for their reduction in air pollutants as well, as one of the strategies for that. So, and they are a new technology. So if you're in a city that prides itself on being innovative, well, electric vehicles are an innovative transportation technology. So looking at ways to support it through that lens can be useful too. I was going to ask another question, Michael and Dan, on the kind of the big picture. Did Tucson hire a consultant to help with the Eevee Readiness map? Was it done in-house? Who led that charge?
It was no external consultant was hired for it. We looked at consultants for fleet analysis and ultimately didn't do that. It was mostly put together through the mayor's office, and I did help kind of tweak it, but they, Fatima Luna, who I think is a part of the larger group, kind of did an extraordinary job of proposing a very comprehensive roadmap for the city. I mean, thorough, incredibly thorough, and I think you can see that in the number of actions and range of departments. And so I just really all done internally, and then after we went through, it was passed about a year ago, then we kind of sat down with departments and said, hey, what works? What is there anything here that jumps out that doesn't work? And that was some of that vetting that I talked about early in my presentation, to say what doesn't resonate as part of this roadmap. And we actually found very little department pushback in the items. I mean, there was some housekeeping, so to speak, in terms of jurisdictional boundary, in terms of we wanting to promote school buses, but that's not really part of the city's portfolio. But more or less, it was all done in-house and then and shared out that way, which was an incredible feat, frankly.
Hey, Michael, this is Karen with the City of Phoenix. Two questions for you. Has Tucson undergone any kind of EV charging siting planning study? And number two, what kind of tool or process are you going through for your equity planning?
Good questions. The first is kind of, we Tucson Electric Power did a demand analysis. That's not like an electrical demand analysis, but a charging demand analysis to say where is it located, and if looking back at that map of adoption and EV adoption, what we found was, frankly, the affluent areas are going to be most prone to need it. Having come from California and been there for a long time, kind of at the 10 years ago is I think where we are today. A lot of, I think it's range anxiety, I think, in public charging stations. I think Dan's data really pointed us in the right direction. 80% of charging is done at home. I think that's consistent with my experience there. You can just kind of do it cheaper. And if you have access, you can do that. And that's kind of ideal from a charging perspective. So equity is kind of front of mind for mayor and council. And so we're looking at how do we address equity issues without investing a bunch of dollars in stranded infrastructure. I mean, I think what we did 10 years ago, we installed some charging stations that literally never got used before their end of useful life. And so that's why I think you're looking at EV ready codes, running conduits so that when the demand is there. And then we're also looking at on-street charging as part of our code updates. And we're looking at street pole for the opportunity to kind of come in and do it inexpensively for locations that may not have in-home parking or access on their panel. That's how we're kind of addressing some of those barriers. And the more we can do, I think, around reducing barriers for entry into electric vehicles for citizens, I think the better. And so probably, I don't know if we're also partnering with local dealerships to perhaps include some information about resources that could be available to them both through TEP, our electric provider, as well as some of the on-street light pole charging as we go down that road.
And what about any other kinds of equity programs such as bike share, ride share, car share, e-mobility options? Are you just looking at charger options?
Right now, as part of the Eevee Roadmap, it's kind of solely focused on the electric vehicle charging options. We do have some bike sharing in Tucson, but I anticipate we're currently in the process of developing and updating our climate action plan. And I would think that some of those issues and opportunities would be addressed as part of that effort.
Great, thank you. We have one question, and then I think we'll probably wrap up. Mike Timor had mentioned in the chat, like way back, it is great that you're thinking 30 years out, but if you expect about 100% BEV by 2050, why are you setting the EV readiness requirements so low? You are leaving up to 80% of the retrofit costs you sought to avoid.
So a lot of it's political. It's also not understanding having exact numbers on when that adoption is going to take off. So what we're doing now is something that's a balance between the actual costs and getting ourselves started on it. I think what's going to end up happening, and you saw the recommendation from our planning commission that we should come back and take a look at it after 1 or 2 years. We can reassess it in a couple years. And if that adoption rate went from 1 to 2.5, 4, whatever, we can kind of adjust based on that. I think getting something in place now is going to be a big step, and we can always in the future. I agree, it's probably not, especially for multifamily, it's probably not enough or what we really want, but that's pretty much the reason why.
Thank you. Anthony, I'll let you have the last question. You said, did the building department have any input in the development of the code amendments? I guess that would be a Dan question.
Yeah. So whenever we do code amendments, we make sure that we have an internal working group that is usually, it's the zoning administrator, myself, as well as some of our staff, but we always include our building official as well as the other people that deal with this. So we have the person who does all of our electrical review, who reviews this. When we did the single family residential, we had, you know, our residential reviewers take a look at it to make sure that it works and that we're in line with them. So yes.
Thank you. Karen and Danae, any last questions from you guys as the co-chairs?
Well, certainly I have 1,000 more questions, but I won't ask them. I'll take those offline. But I did want to thank Dan and Michael. That was very helpful, informative, and we look forward to getting your feedback and update when you go to council.
And congratulations. This is a huge milestone. If I'm not misspeaking, I believe you're the first in the state to have an Eevee roadmap. And we thank you for leading the state in that effort. And we're looking to you, as many of us are looking to do similar work. And then I was just so nobody missed it. If you are in SRP territory, Jamie put in here that SRP is offering that $1,500 per port or $4,000 per port. This is for level 2 if you are a government, school, or nonprofit. And then they do have a $20,000 fleet assessment. So if you're looking for some assistance and you're in SRP territory, Jamie would be a good person to reach out to, it looks like.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Michael, so much for your